Hello and welcome to Authors on Tap. My name is Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, stage manager, and a few volunteers from Exile Bookville here in the Fine Arts Building in downtown Chicago. Today, we are having our third event in 24 hours right here in 2 floors above our bookstore, Suite 410, which affords these amazing views. Outside views, of course, in Zoom, you can't see this, views of Grant Park, the lake, Buckingham Fountain, and if you, oh, there you go, I was going to say, just Google the intro to Married Children, and we'll be transported right here. Thanks for this. Today we are here to celebrate Steve Almond's new novel, All the Secrets of the World. Which I just read this week, and it's incredible. Like, I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you made this happen, and Rebecca made this happen, and I'm glad that you came by Chicago for this event. But the book is amazing. Like, the book is, it's not really a crime thriller, but it gives you all pieces in the beginning, and you start to figure things out. And talk about it takes place in my hometown and during my youth, and so you were taking me down streets I had not thought of in like, awesome. Yeah, a long time. So it really brought me. I haven't been home in a long time, and I've been in Chicago for years. So thank you so much. I love this novel. Steve's going to be in conversation with Rebecca Makkai, author of The Great Believers, among other things, and she's a fantastic person to speak to about all things literature. I think this is going to be an amazing event. I'm going to get out of the way and let you guys do it. You guys, please help me welcome Rebecca Makkai and Steve Almond.
Hi, everyone. And hi, everyone on Zoom. I know some of you are joining us on Zoom. So yeah, with a full Zoom too. So I'm really pleased to be introducing this promising young debut novelist. Whose work I've been reading for like 20 years. It is a debut novel, despite all odds. And so that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. But welcome, all of our views in Chicago are exactly like this. This is really pretty normal for anyone. just like anyone who's up there and sees that. But I am so excited about this novel, and one thing that I kind of talked about a few minutes ago is that when someone is a really accomplished story writer, which you are, and then they sit down to write a novel finally, and maybe many books in because it feels like they really were a short story writer and they're finally doing this thing, so often that novel feels like a stitched together story collection. Either pretty literally, like chapter by chapter with different people in different places, or it's just kind of episodic. Maybe it's one long short story, it doesn't have the heft of the novel. And you've gotten into this book, it is a full throttle novel. This is a crime thriller, it is a coming of age story. You've got scientific stuff, you've got the viewpoint literally of Nancy Reagan, you've got Mormons in Mexico, you've got like incarceration, you've got detective, you've got and huge sweeping cause and effect across the whole novel, not like little fires put out, but huge arcs. So I know you're going to read for us in a minute. We're just going to talk for a minute first. And one of the things I want to ask you before you read is about not a switch necessarily, because I know that for a long time you've been experimenting with novel writing. It's an experiment. No, but like this is not. It's not like you suddenly 3 years ago sat down and said, "I now should begin to write my first novel."
No.
This has been going on for a while. So it's not like you flipped a switch, but I want to talk to you about that move into longer narrative and why this feels like a really full throttle experienced novel from an experienced novelist rather than a short story writer trying to write a novel, because it doesn't feel like that.
Well, thank you. My process for writing a novel is to write over 30 years or so a series of really bad novels, and usually fall into depression afterwards and have some therapy, and then write some nonfiction work or some short stories, which is my native kind of like what I grew up as a writer writing. And I know, I think I figured out that form, the short story, feels natural to me. It's like, okay, it's anecdotal. It's like you're sitting next to somebody on the bar stool saying another believe this crazy story. Whereas a novel is more like, yeah, you know, we're going to be here a while. There's probably going to be 8 or 10 times that we're going to visit, sit down, take your shoes off, I'll put the kettle on. It's like a big long saga with the architecture of a novel is so complicated. All these characters and their trajectories are intersecting and interdependent, going off in different directions. It sounds very difficult as I describe it. And
it is.
Yeah, it is. And reading Great Believers, you sort of see, oh my God, 2 timelines and characters move through time. The novels I wrote in my 30s and 40s were terrible, and they were bad because they were self-regarding, and they weren't really imaginatively conceived. And the main thing about them that really was terrible is that they didn't have any rising action, which it turns out a novel needs.
Yes, that's what we were told back in 6th grade, and it turns out
Right.
which arts teacher was right.
I missed
I see
that.
that. It's true.
Yeah, I missed that day. So I was just writing books where lots of things happen, this and this and this and this, and I missed that it really needs to be more like this happens and therefore this happened, because of that this next thing happened. What Aristotle calls kind of like the chain of consequence, the artful construction of incidents so that they feel culminating rather than just consecutive. And that was a revelation to realize, oh, plot is your friend. Plot is the thing that allows you to stop having to push the language around because you haven't solved the problem of story. And because this, the plot of this book, or at least the central character and her internal conflict, was very clear to me right from the start. I could really, it was the feeling writing it of sort of chasing her, chasing the cause and effect, rather than pushing her around, hoping she might bump into plot and self-revelation and all the big ticket items. So that was good.
Yeah,
That was
I'm just laughing because that's very true. Makes
right.
Go do something.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, well, I think, and this is something that's interesting because you and I both read a lot of student work. One thing where people say, well, is it worth it for me to keep working on this? And a really good question to ask is the piece of writing giving you energy, or are you having to feed energy into it? Because the feeling is familiar to me from these terrible novels of having to pour energy in, try to get it going. And the feeling writing this thing was much more that it was giving me energy, and I was being drawn through it mostly by Verena, the central characters, kind of her courage and bravery and the kind of danger that she was letting herself into. One other thing that was important is, at a certain point, a friend of mine said to me in my late 40s, as I was complaining about being a failed novelist, he said, I don't think you really want to write a novel. I think you want to be a novelist. And I get good and angry at that, as we always do when somebody has our number. But you know, this sort of the central thing that I realize is, oh yeah, this is a narcissistic thing for me. I want to feel like I've written a novel and I can put that on my resume, which is different than being genuinely curious about the fate of a set of characters and having them come to you and getting worried about them, and also, you know, sort of seeing them into danger and somehow seeing if they survive it. So I gave up on the project of writing a novel. Just said, that's fine. You know, David Hockney paints. I don't need to paint. There's plenty of wonderful novelists around, and that was very freeing. Doing that allowed me, somehow opened up a certain kind of space for the muse to walk Lorena into my life. And it's a real lesson. Like when you put a lot of pressure on yourself to find the keys or to write a novel, you're almost surely not going to. Well.
Did you, when you found that character of Lorena, and you kind of started, did you know the first time you sat down and started writing about it, did you know then that was a novel, or did you think it was something else?
No, I had a pretty clear sense that the kind of trouble that she was going to get into was big trouble.
Yeah, novel-length trouble.
Novel-length trouble. And then as she got into more and more trouble, she kept running into other characters, and rather than just allowing those characters to be viewed through Lorena's viewpoint and kind of flattened out, I said, well, actually, those characters have their own lives that they're leading, their own backstory, and their own set of motives. And I got curious, as you do as a novelist, you get curious about all the characters, even Nancy Reagan, so that you ultimately cannot flatten them out, even though I'd spent 40 years flattening Nancy Reagan's, kind of astrological disc.
She's already pretty flat.
Well, but that's what I thought too. And then I started
Yeah.
like thinking more about, because we entered the novel's 1981, and Reagan's just been inaugurated, and then a few months later shot and almost killed. And as much as Nancy Reagan is like painfully blind to the destructiveness of her behavior, she's also a traumatized partner who wants to keep her partner safe. So if she wants to believe in astrology and double down on that and run the White House agenda based on whether the moon is in Aquarius, well, that's her way of trying to keep her husband safe, and we would do the same thing. So.
I actually found a lot of empathy in her. Anyone who's not read the book yet and is really confused about Nancy Reagan is, there's sort of, this crime, this basically, if I can say this man has staged his own disappearance in the Southern California desert. Someone's being blamed for his murder, which of course we know didn't happen. It's the brother of Lorena, this main character, and Nancy Reagan knew the wife of the guy who disappeared, is hearing about this all, and sort of just appears a few times throughout the novel, kind of absorbing it all and putting the finger in it. And
she shifts on her throne, and when people shift on their throne and were really powerful, other people's worlds experience an earthquake.
Yeah. It's funny because the first time you introduced her, which is not that far in, like 75 pages in, I thought, oh, you're going to do this once. You're flipping around,
No way.
and then she like comes back, and at the end there's a lot. It's like, and I was just so glad because I this thing that I thought was a one-time treat turns out to be this buffet.
Yeah.
The Nancy Reagan buffet.
Right.
So do you, beyond what I just said, because I feel like I'm always going to butcher someone else's novel, assuming that probably some people have read it and some people haven't, do you want to maybe give them more of a sort of elevator pitch description so they know what they're in for?
Well, I don't know about the elevator pitch. That's tough. I always say like, oh, it's like Jane Eyre meets Breaking Bad. People are like, what? What are you talking about? But the book begins anyway with this young woman, Lorena Simons, who's Honduran American. Her mother and brother are undocumented. Their mom came over, so she was born in the United States. And she's in 8th grade. She's paired for the science fair by a well-meaning 8th grade teacher with Jenny Stallworth, who's like the glamorous, blonde, beautiful, rich classmate of hers. And it's set in 1981. And the great thing about 1981 is people went to people's houses. Like kids would go to other kids' houses, as I did. I'm sure you did.
Including kids you didn't know. That's what was different. It's not just your friend. It's like we got a project, so.
Right. We can't do this by Google Docs. And text. So Lorena, who lives with her, with her mom in a really economically depressed part of town, walks into the Stallworth's mint green mansion, and she's completely dazzled. And each of the Stallworth parents, for different reasons, take a kind of unnatural interest in her. And she's completely seduced by them in different ways. And, she's become invisible in a way that's very exciting to her, but because of her family and the fact that they're undocumented, it's very dangerous for her to become visible and off we go.
So we talked maybe about you reading something from, you can sip your wine, it's okay. Reading something from the book. And so this would be Marcus Stallworth. This is the father of this rich family. He's the one who's going to disappear. He is a scientist who primarily studies scorpions.
Yeah.
He's
a scorpiologist.
Is that the word? Okay.
That's
I
the
would
word.
think it would be some other word that you'd have to like, be like a Hammerschmidt on an album, and you're like, oh yeah, that's the Latin word, the Greek word for that.
Right.
It's just scorpiologist because it's funny. All right.
Zoologically specified arachnidologist.
Great. But so he ends up taking his daughter and Lorena
Right.
into the desert.
Right.
Is that what you're gonna?
Yeah, I'll read this little scene. So the Rosemary, who's Jenny's mom, sort of gets the idea she's going to help the girls and encourages Marcus, who is a scientist, he's a scorpiologist, and they get this idea that they'll go out into the desert and Mr. Stallworth will show them scorpions. This involves putting snake chaps on, and when Jenny Stallworth has snake chaps put on by her father, she decides that she would prefer not to engage in an activity requiring snake chaps. A reasonable point of view. But for this reason, it's sort of one of the first times you realize how courageous Lorena is. Lorena's like, I'll go, let's do it. And so she goes out with Mr. Stallworth and Glenn Stallworth, who's Jenny's kind of handsome asshole of a brother. He's like a soccer playing asshole, the me character, in other words. And so, yeah, I'll just read this little scene. Mr. Stallworth led them into the darkness. He lugged an oversized lantern, which he set down on a small rise. This is in the Mojave Desert around Death Valley. Close your eyes, he said, and keep them shut until I say, do it, Glenn murmured. Okay, open. An iridescent purple light gleamed out in all directions. Lorena's eyes scrolled an ocean of sand upon which now lay scattered scores of tiny glow-in-the-dark toys, the sort kids on TV pulled from cereal boxes. Then the toys began to move. Lorena gasped. These were living creatures, many-legged and scrabbling like tiny lobsters. Welcome to Scorpionville, Glenn said. You'll notice that Glenn was really quite articulate. Welcome to Scorpionville. Lorena glanced at the sand around her feet. A scorpion the length of a hairpin labored under the weight of its stinger, which hung like a fang jewel over the armored segments of its body. Don't be frightened, Mr. Stallworth said. He was suddenly right beside her. I'm not, Lorena replied. What do you think? There, Lorena cast about for the right word, stunned to find the truth in such a simple one. They're beautiful. She could feel Mr. Stallworth inspecting her face, trying to figure out if she really meant it. He took off his glasses and began furiously polishing the lenses with the hem of his shirt. For a queer moment, Lorena imagined grabbing his glasses and tossing them away. You going to take any home? Glenn asked. Mr. Stallworth pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and swept the purple beam across the sand. We might as well see who's out tonight. To Lorena's astonishment, he knelt down and guided a scorpion onto his palm. The animal was the size of a matchbox. Its pinchers pawed the air. Shouldn't you have gloves? Lorena said. You just come at them from behind, Glenn said. They can't sting backwards. They're not aggressive animals, Mr. Stallworth explained. They just want to be left alone. Mr. Stallworth returned his focus to the animal. You see these little hairs along their legs? He said, this is how they hunt, by touch, by vibration. They can register the movement of a single grain of sand from 10 yards away. Why do they shine? Lorena said. Nobody knows. Fluorescence must convey some kind of evolutionary advantage, but it's still their little secret. Glenn asked his father to find a scorpion he could pick up. Mr. Stallworth scanned the ground with his magic light. These are your best bet, he said. Sand scorpions. Aren't they poisonous? Lorena said. This species isn't too bad. She watched Mr. Stallworth gently prod the scorpion onto Glenn's hand. The creature scampered along his knuckles. It looked glum, menacing, painfully shy. Are you going to pick one up? Glenn asked Lorena. I'm sure she's had enough excitement for one night, Mr. Stallworth said. I'm not scared. The words came out louder than Lorena intended. More softly, she added, I'd like to hold one. Mr. Stallworth switched on the lantern. He stared at her face again, half in wonder, and picked up another one, bluish under the light, a gentle species, he said. It sting no worse than a wasp. She reached out, and Mr. Stallworth uncurled her fingers. The earth was trembling beneath her. Then she realized that it was her, and not the earth. You don't have to do this, Mr. Stallworth said. I know. Do you trust me? She met his gaze and nodded, and Mr. Stallworth lowered the animal onto her. No way, Glenn said. That's Glenn. That's all those great lines. No way. The creature clung to the knob of her wrist like a charm. Slowly, tentatively, it began to move toward her hand, the legs rising and falling like jointed oars. Lorena's pulse lurched. She kept her eyes. She closed her eyes to keep from flinching. Tiny feet tickled her palm. She felt the dampness beneath her clothes, the dizziness of what was going to happen next. When she could stand it no longer, she opened her eyes. The scorpion was perched on her thumb, perfectly still, its stinger hoisted like a tiny scythe. He appears to like you, Mr. Stallman, she said. Creepy.
And it's funny, I think the first time I certainly heard that, which because we did a reading together, you know, it's like, this is lovely, and it is. And then reading the book, and this is lovely. And now having read the rest of the book and looking back on that, it's like, oh my God, that's creepy as well. For a number of reasons, right? And you scared them away. So this leads me into a question about place, because I realize, I kind of as I read the book, I was reflecting on the fact that although I consider myself fairly well traveled, I don't believe I have ever seen a scorpion. They certainly aren't here. And I've been, you know, to events like Tucson,
Right.
and San Diego, and that doesn't quite do it. So I know that you live in Boston. I don't actually know your background with this area, and I know this is a great interest to Javier. But what is your connection with the Mojave Desert, Southern California? Where does this come from?
Well, I'll just say the reason you haven't seen scorpions is because scorpions haven't wanted you to see them.
Okay.
So they're nocturnal, and they hide.
Okay.
They don't. In fact, the theory as to why they fluoresce that Lorena comes up with is essentially that it's like a proto-eye. It's like an alarm system. It's the way that they figure out how to find shelter and be, you know, out of view, because they consider themselves to be prey. We consider them to be predators.
Right.
So
well, isn't that the way it always works? I mean,
that's the way it works, right? That's the way it works.
Humans too, yeah.
But I spent 4 years in El Paso, straight out of college, and I was actually taken out into the desert by a couple of scorpiologists who lit up an ultraviolet lamp, and I saw all the scorpions suddenly fluoresce and the sand around me appeared completely, you know, just in blank, it seemed like. And it was this real moment of revelation of like, wow, the world that we consider barren and empty is actually alive in unseen, you know, with sort of unseen ways. So that made a big impression, and I'm sure you feel this way too. Like, especially in a novel, the story itself, the kind of the force of the plot is like this big rocket taking off, and it's got all the jets kind of suck things out of your artistic unconscious, events and memories that are unresolved. And so for me, so like that experience, that intense experience of having scorpions sort of come alight all around me, like I never forgot that. And it was hanging around, as was a friend of mine's father being abducted mysteriously in the desert when I was around Lorena's age.
Whoa, okay. And did you know what happened to him? What was the...
Well, I do, yes, I do. I recommend you guys have wine too. We get way more entertaining.
Right, seriously.
I do know what happened, but I think the point is, like, what I remember of that episode was all the speculation. I remember going to my friend's house whose dad had been abducted and seeing his mother, who I had a crush on, a beautiful woman, and her hair turned white overnight. And that I remember.
Oh my God.
So that finds its way in the book too. So all these sort of details and memories that you have feelings about that are unresolved and hanging around in your unconscious, and as you're writing the story, they get sucked out.
Right, which is a reason I think not to go in overly prescriptive about what you think you're going to write about, because then you don't have room for that stuff.
Right, exactly.
But so you have not lived in Southern California.
No.
So this is kind of okay. So I think then.
I grew up in California.
But not that part.
Not that far. No.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Palo Alto.
Okay.
But the Palo Alto of the 70s. So Palo Alto of the 70s was not the Palo Alto of the 2000s. So certainly the 20s.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It was before there were computers. So it was more like Sacramento, as I envisioned it was now, kind of a quieter place.
Yeah.
And I was also interested, like, California in the American mythos is like the promised land. It's where the orchards are, the Joe family is heading to, or the gold prospectors are heading to get gold, or it's the dream factory of LA, or it's Silicon Valley, which is like the modern sort of gold rush. But most of California is more like El Paso. Most of it is desert. The vast majority of it is just desert. And then there's also a central part of the state that's mostly crops that are sort of invisibly farmed by people like Lorraine's dad. And so I think I wanted to write about the parts of California that generally don't get written about.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So that would be maybe one of, not maybe, maybe one of many ways in which you're writing outside of your lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you're writing, really beautifully from the viewpoint of a teenage girl, more than one teenage girl, actually. You're writing about, can we spoiler-ish, from the point of view of a man who's interested in teenage girls,
Right.
which is, must feel scary and dangerous, right, from that point of view.
Sure.
And then you're writing from the viewpoint of multiple Honduran American characters, right, police, you're not a cop,
Right.
you're doing, a lot of those things, which I think again for me fits into this, this sense of this really being novel, that like you have to in a novel, as much as we're, I think for good reason and to good end, cautious right now in fiction about, when can we write from what points of view. Those are great questions to ask, but if you're going to write a novel, you're going to write from other points of view, because you can't write a solipsistic novel. And you're doing so many of those things. Look, Nancy, but you're also not Nancy Reagan, as far as I know.
So I sometimes at night
I mean, so do you feel like this, more than your short stories, which certainly, I mean, you're not, it's not like you're writing very personal autobiographical short stories, but there's maybe, not a sense of having to dig into someone's histories and identity in the same way.
Right.
Did those multiple leaps into other points of view, other identities, that feel fundamentally different than what you've been doing in your short fiction?
Yeah,
I feel like short fiction prepared you.
Well, I wrote a lot of stories from female points of view, but the gist of this is that there's this long overdue reckoning in the literary world, other pieces of the culture kind of moving backwards, sort of before the Enlightenment. The literary world is realizing, like what we think of as literature, what we think of as history is actually white guy history, white guy stories, and that should be corrected. And there are all these underrepresented voices and stories that haven't been told. And if those stories should be elevated and amplified, which they should, then the best people to tell those stories are the people who've lived those lives. 100% agree. But then sort of middle-aged white guys like me then face a question, which is not something I thought about when I was writing the book. I was just chasing the story. Honestly, all of this is sort of looking back. But as I thought about the book I'd written and sort of thought, wow, did I go a lot of places that are not my lived experience? I started thinking about the social novel as a tradition, right? From Victor Hugo through Dickens, Dostoevsky, and the American tradition, De Passos, and Steinbeck, and Ralph Ellison, Zora Neale Hurston, all these remarkable social novels. And the whole idea is to, in a social novel, is to portray what's happening with individuals, but they're trapped in larger systems of power, and they're influenced by those larger systems of power. And in order to write a good social novel, you have to enter into the experiences of all the characters, even the Nancy Reagans, so that none of them get flattened out, because nobody walks around saying, oh, I get it, I'm the villain of this story. I'm the person who acts badly. That's just not how human beings operate. They construct a story in which they're the hero or the victim.
Yes.
And so for me, that meant when Lorena, the muse, walked her into my life, I wasn't saying, oh, can I write this or not? I was just going, oh my God, what happened next? What's her, she wants to be visible, but it's dangerous for her to become visible. And in what ways is she going to become visible? And then what happens after that? I was not thinking or auditing. I wasn't thinking like a commissar. I was thinking like a novelist, which is to be curious. And when she encounters other characters, rather than just saying, oh, you know, it's the cop character, I wanted to say, who is Pedro Guerrero? Why does he make the decisions he makes in this novel?
Yeah.
So it felt very natural and organic to me. And only in retrospect did I sort of say, oh, the other thing that a novelist has to decide right at the beginning, you can speak to this, Rebecca, because you decided to write about characters who are gay and who were in the midst of this plague, and there's a lot of politics around that. Your decision was partly born, not necessarily even consciously, out of a feeling that you wanted the reader to imaginatively enter into those lives and realize that they mattered and that they happened. And the way that novelists do that is they have to enter into the lives of those characters and enter into their, you know, sort of write deeply into their experiences. And if all we did was write our own experience, then I would constantly be centering white, middle-aged Jewish guys with lots of anxiety and lots of kids, and lots of creative ones. And while that's an interesting story, it's not the story I was interested in this time. And in fact, I was much more interested in directing the reader. Basically, the biggest question that the novelist faces is, who am I asking the reader to pay attention to? Whose life and inner life am I asking the reader to enter into and consider important and worthy of attention?
Because you have to make choices on that, right? Like there's a sort of almost Wikipedia sense of like, well, there's a hyperlink and I can click on that and click on that and click on that, right? And now I'm, you know, the mother-in-law's mailman and I'm over here. So you have, even in a novel that feels like we have access to everyone's head, I could go in any direction at any time, you're choosing. There's
Big time.
one police officer whose head we're in, there are other police officers whose head we're not in.
Right.
There are people whose, like Lorena, whose experience is centered, and then people like Jenny, her friend whose father disappears, we do get into her head for much briefer periods of time.
Right.
So, you know, you're making those decisions. I think my instinct would be, maybe based on my own experience, I think based on what I've read, you know, of this book, more, not necessarily entirely guided by curiosity, but also guided by where the story needs to go.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can be curious about the mother-in-law's mailman, but does he belong in the story? Probably not.
Right.
So,
and in fact, so as I was writing more deeply, so I wrote this book, the first half of it before the 2016 election. Then the 2016 election happened, I went crazy, wrote a book to try to explain the 2016 election or sort of what it's the result of, and then wrote another little book because I was in an agitated state and I wasn't able to enter into the imagined world of this novel, which is kind of a fragile thing. When you have this, what Wallace Stevens called the pressure of the real, it kind of squashes your imagination. It's hard to stay in an imagined world when the news cycle is always serving up senseless murder and political malfeasance and whatever else. So when I went back to the book, it was a very different America. And America that was happening when I went back to the book in 2018, 2019, like the US government with our tax dollars and our tacit approval was in the business of taking traumatized refugee children away from their parents and guardians after they walked 1,000 miles and fucking risked their lives and causing permanent trauma to those families, which we actually participated in morally, not to be a jerk, but I did too. We allowed that to happen. It was clearly the most fascistic thing this country's done in a long time. I'm not saying something. So if you think about the direction that the novel takes later, of course I'm going to go into the lives of the most vulnerable characters, and they're vulnerable in the same exact ways that those kids coming from Central America are vulnerable. That's Tony's story, really, the brother. And I didn't like sit there and consciously think that through, but I do think I was morally impelled in that direction, because the question is, who's at risk in this kind of novel? The question is like, who is at risk? And it's not interesting to write about the ways in which the stalwarts are at risk, because they're going to be just fine. They've got plenty of margin for error, but Lorena's mother and brother are not going to be okay. So I felt like the book naturally and necessarily gravitates towards their experience.
It's interesting. So you're talking about sort of the cultural level and the novel of ideas, and that the characters, by definition, are shaped by their environments, which of course all characters in all novels are, but this is very much a novel about people in a certain time or a certain political environment. But then you, as the author, are also this person being acted upon by the political events that are happening as you're writing the novel.
Yep.
And in this case, it's different, you know, it's not only, it's 40 years of difference almost.
Yeah.
And you live on the East Coast, this is happening on the West Coast, but the things that are shaping you are then shaping the novel that you are writing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not like I'm consciously working all this out.
No.
It's like the artistic unconscious is shaping things, and the social novelists like Dickens or whoever else, I think they are shaped by what's happening around them. And
Yeah.
like Reagan, I was interested in Reagan because I lived through the Reagan Revolution, you know, what they call the Reagan Revolution. And when he told that story about America's a mansion on the hill, it was like a beautiful story. It's a kind of compared to today's what I'll call sort of eugenic psychosis, which is essentially where the right is at this point. It was really optimistic and sunny. He was saying like America's a mansion on the hill, but nobody ever said, well, wait a second, who lives in that mansion? And who cleans that mansion? And like who gets arrested if they trespass on that mansion?
Yeah.
So as a kid growing up in California with Reagan as this kind of sunny figure of national optimism, I was like, I think that story's bullshit. And I think underneath that sort of ad campaign was a different philosophy that Reagan actually put forth in a literal speech that appears in part at the end of the book.
Yeah.
And his idea was really basic. Basically government should be almost entirely eliminated when it comes to money. Let the corporations run everything, deregulate small government, government's the problem, except in the matter of law enforcement and the criminal justice system and incarceration. In that case, he believed and articulated forcefully that there were certain people who are inherently evil and don't let any social worker or psychiatrist or anybody tell you differently. They're just certain people who are evil, and there are certain people who are good, and it is the job of government to vigorously protect the good from the iniquitous.
Yeah.
And he never said anything about race or class, but it was. But now it is obvious what he meant.
Right.
The right is kind of saying it out loud.
It was already there in the fabric of society, and there was no reason he needed to say it when that was already.
Right.
It was so woven in, yeah. And you get towards the end, this sense of almost fatalism about Lorena's brother, who's being kind of framed for this murder. But you know,
Spoiler alert.
this sense of like, Nancy Reagan going, well, he had Scorpio and Mars in this astrological sense, and other people going, well, he's a prophet. Right. And then this just the kind of beatifying of Marcus Stolberg, the guy who's sort of disappearance, who is
Much more dark.
a very dark figure, but someone from his church says he's so good, and yeah.
One of the people here is one of my former Neiman Fellows. I teach all these journalists at the Neiman Fellowship and covers crime. And, you know, Peter knows that part of what the media does, simply because it's part of their business model, is to create moral panics. And when you create a moral panic, then you have to find the perpetrator. And that pressure is put on police officers and prosecutors, and they act on it. This is why the Innocence Project keeps finding out that people were wrongly accused and convicted. But when I was an investigative reporter in Miami at the New Times, there was a big case that was the Bird Road rapist case. And once the media has a name for a criminal,
Oh my God,
that criminal is going to get caught.
And they call it the Death Valley
The Death
Killer.
Valley
Yeah,
Killer.
that's what they start calling it. Yeah.
That's right. And once you have that up on the screen, that's it. Somebody is going to be found. A perp is going to be found, and chances are that perp is going to be poor and brown. And in the case of the Bird Road rapist, it was a guy named Louis Diaz, who was a Cuban American immigrant. And there is, looking at the case as I did, 20 years later, it is so obvious that there's no way he could have committed any of these crimes, let alone, 25 of them. And he's eventually exonerated, but it was after 26 years in prison that he was exonerated. And it's not because the cops and prosecutors decide to be corrupt. It's because there are pressures that bear on them that change their incentives, and they don't even realize.
Subconsciously, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So we're going to open things up, if you're okay with that,
Yeah, sure.
to questions, including questions on Zoom. I want to frantically type. And what I'll do is I'm going to stall for time until someone raises their hand. Someone should raise their hand, even if it's very basic.
I actually really enjoy the awkward tension, the kind of shared.
Right, oh, should we
shame.
sit in silence and stare at them until they?
It's my favorite part of
Holly
it.
has a question.
There is one.
It's not even my question. I can't take credit for it. It's somebody who was on Zoom who was worried that she might not be able to hear it. So she probably can't hear it. But I'll just put it out there because it's a good question. And I'm reading it, but it was something like there was something he told you many years ago that changed the way you write.
Oh, it was, okay, this is what I put out, this is what I was studying on Twitter to get everyone here, which is true, I wasn't lying. No, so, okay, let's do this, because we know each other. So in 2005, when I was 3 years old, I was a student at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference.
Just a little toddler.
I know, so they were like, what, this is Prodigy, she's so cute, look at her cheeks. So the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, which is kind of like the Harvard of the writers, it's like the first writers conference in the country, Vermont, it's great. So I was there, I was in that and I don't think you weren't official faculty, you were there as a visiting something. Slumming, yes. Kind of coming in like, I'll do this for a cup of barefoot Chardonnay and a pretzel and like.
That was my rival.
Right. But you taught something that you've been teaching, I think, ever since, similar to what you taught for us at StoryStudio last night, a class on writing sex scenes,
right,
which was just maybe an hour and a half long,
right.
And there were a bunch of us crammed into a room, and you never remember that I was there. So that's totally since then. And we started a great class, and we had a great time. There was a reading that night that some of the students tried to do of hastily written sexy writing, some of which was very bad. Very, very bad.
There was a guy who just said the word penis over and over again. Very guy thing. Yeah.
There was a lot of
really radical work, dude.
Right? You shocked us all. But that was, I think I'd known of your work before then, and then I was like, honestly, I gotta read everything this guy's done. But that definitely, I think it's a subject that very few writers talk about, and that particular class definitely has informed a lot of the ways that I write that kind of scene going forward. I think the most salient point being, very unsexily, that when people have sex, they think about other stuff.
Right.
That's really the thing that I
the amount of time people spend. Glad you really grabbed the center. Very, very sophisticated thinking about the erotic. But it's true. That's one of the things I tell people, just if you're wondering how to write about sex, think about how sex happens in your life, right? Sometimes it's fantasy, sometimes you're on your own, sometimes you're there, but you're like disconnected, and you're thinking about other things, you're preoccupied, or you're deep in your anxiety, or your shame. We did this class last night, and I sort of trick people into writing a really filthy scene by giving them a piece of bad erotica that is way over the top. And people generally avoid writing about, not you, but other people avoid writing about sex because they get performance anxiety. And they get worried and anxious and inhibited in the ways that we do when we're in the world thinking about it, and the possibility of the erotic. And so I trick people into writing, I read them a horrible sex scene, and I say, write a terrible sex scene. And then, as we know, for the people who were there, they write these incredible sex scenes. Not incredible that they're so hot, but they're so true and they're so painful because they get it, the fact that sexuality is really this experience that we're so anxious about and ashamed of and worried about and preoccupied with. And sometimes there's that connection, but a lot of times it's much more performative. And I'm always interested in moments where things that are secret are coming out into the open. And part of the reason that this book was easier for me to write was that every character is bearing two different kinds of secrets. Secrets that they're keeping from the world, which are dangerous, but the most dangerous ones are the secrets that they're keeping from themselves. And when those suddenly appear, you realize that that's, the central danger in writing is self-revelation. Somebody comes up against the truth of themselves. But it's very exciting. In the room last night, as people were writing these sex scenes, the characters kept coming up against something that was undoubtedly true and painful and surprising. All of us were like, oh my God, that's how it is, isn't it?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, it's I think that idea too of like the whole character coming to bear on that scene. It's not like you leave that character behind and you go into
Yeah,
right? Like,
they have a name for that, where the human being doesn't come with the sex scene. It's called pornography.
yeah, right.
Right? And that's the allure of it. Like, oh, you just perform and everything happens perfectly and everybody has a walloping orgasm. It's like, sure. Yeah. Try that at home.
I have more to say about that. Yes, you're going to save me from that.
A person of friend who is embarking on novel writing as his required pursuit. And before we came, we had dinner, we discussed the differences between writing fiction and nonfiction, and really experience in both. So you discussed how you process the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, sure. Because I also teach the Niemans, and when I teach at Wesleyan, I'm teaching both fiction and nonfiction. So people try to get very mystical about nonfiction and try to sort of make the definition of it a lot blurrier than it is. Talk about emotional truth and so forth. But it is not that complicated, at least to describe. Nonfiction is a radically subjective version of events that objectively took place. When people start inventing things and asserting that they happen, that's okay. It's an imaginative act, but it has a name. It's called fiction. Okay? And you should be honest with the reader when you're doing that. So I think it's legitimate to say, well, I was going to confront my father after all these years, and I imagined that it would go like this. That's okay. That's still nonfiction, because it's your fantasy of how it's going to play out. If you say it happened like this, and my father said this, and I said that, and you know that to not be true, well, then that's fiction, right? Just in terms of a definition. And it's also true that your memory is not a recording device. It is infallible. It's fallible, rather. It's fallible. So like when I was 10 years old, I was in a dirt field in Hollister, California with my older brother, Dave, who I worshiped, and also he was very mean to me and I was very angry at him. And we were hitting dirt clods with a aluminum baseball bat. And I remember very distinctly that even though Dave was behind me, I swung the bat back, and I remember very distinctly the spongy crack of the bat hitting his mouth, and I remember turning around, and I remember the blood exploding. And I carried around the guilt of, oh my God, I hit Dave in the head intentionally and tried to kill him, and wrote many terrible poems about it. And I eventually sent one of these terrible poems to Dave. And he said, well, that poem was terrible. And also, that's not how it happened at all. Actually, I had been warned over and over again not to walk into the path of that bat. And I, of my own volition, walked into the path of that bat. Now, the only thing we can say for sure, because we can't say unless somebody was recording it, and it's happening in 1979 or whatever, so we can't. The only thing that we can say for sure is there was blood and there's a scar. The rest is subjective. It's the past is filtered through the emotional and psychological needs of the present. Memory is something that we create. And I hate when authors in nonfiction are very definitive about what happened.
Yeah.
Because what's that?
Yeah, definitive, like definite, like.
Yeah,
yeah.
they say this is exactly how it went down. There's such a lack of humility with that. Because we really just have our version that we carry around. So nonfiction is quite slippery. We're trying to be definitive. But the truth is, if we're completely honest, we're just radically subjective in our view of what transpired. In fiction, the nice thing about fiction, but also the burden of it, is that your job in nonfiction is to recollect and to try to pluck meaning from the rush of experience. Not just to react to things, but to reflect on what they meant. Looking back in time, and you understand that this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then you think a while about them, you process what's happened, and you think about their deeper meaning. And that's what's so pleasurable about a good memoir or a good essay, is you can feel the writer's mind and heart at work. And they're doing something that's very hard for us to do, which is to figure out what things mean, and what it means, and make sense of them at least a little bit. But in fiction, you can make everything up.
Right.
And it's super exciting because you get to engineer a world that's designed for maximum impact. But it also means that you could do anything. And opening those floodgates is imaginatively very intimidating, to me anyway. Unless you have a strong chain of consequence, which I mean is defined for this. It's very intimidating because anything could happen.
And you have to be more definitive. So I think the flip side, whereas in nonfiction, it's like, yeah, embrace the fact that you don't fully remember, please. In fiction, I get really pissy if someone, it's fully fiction, and someone's like, well, the summer that I was 11 or 12 or maybe 13, it's fiction, just tell me, pick one, decide, I believe you, right? I want, you have, I'll believe whatever you say.
Right.
I can't sue you, no one can sue you, it's fiction,
Right.
tell me.
Right. Exactly.
And it's a weird paradox, right? Fiction, which we know to be affected, I want the definite.
Right.
Nonfiction, which we take to be the truth, I want the kind of flexibility, that sponginess. I don't know what's up with that.
My terrible first novel was called A Pack of Dogs, A Pack of Lies. Half of that quote, fiction is a pack of dogs, a pack of lies chasing the truth. And I thought that will give you a sense of how awful that novel is. The attempted cleverness of that title will tell you everything.
It's a little long.
Little
The fact that you couldn't quite remember it right now is maybe telling. What other questions do we have? Yeah.
Yeah, I asked you your advice. I live very interesting life, and I'm in the process of writing a memoir about it, called Very Home. And I'm wondering if I should make it a memoir or a fiction.
Yeah, that is a way too important decision for one of us to weigh in. And I'm saying that, quite seriously. Like, you're going to spend, if you're serious about it, thousands and thousands of hours, right? And you need to, by feel, figure out, as somebody who writes fiction and nonfiction, it was clear to me that when Lorena Saenz, the heroine of All the Secrets of the World, walked into my life, like I was in the land of fiction, very clearly. And sometimes people will say this, like, maybe I'll turn it into a novel, or on the other side, maybe I'll turn it into a memoir. And I'm like, you never really think about the nature of what it is you're working on and what you want it to be, because you're going to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of hours on it, and the choices that you're going to make are already dizzying enough and confounding enough. Like writing, boil all the way the romance away, it's decision making. Every step of it, what word, what sentence, what grammar, the shape of the paragraphs, which characters, which plot. It's when I say it like that, it sounds completely ridiculous that we would even try it.
Right.
It's so intimidating. For years.
Yeah.
So, but you really better think about what it is you want to work on. Do you want to tell your story to the best of your ability, or do you want to invent a story where essentially you can create choose your own adventure, and cast things that create things that didn't happen, and in some ways edit things that did happen. And I have no idea what you should do. I just know that like that's a basic decision. You should know the nature of what you're writing, whether you're telling the reader this actually happened, and here's how I understand these events, or well, this is a story. And it didn't happen, but the emotions that are portrayed here are real, even if the events aren't.
It's interesting, I'm a poet, writer, I've been writing poetry for 50-some years.
That's where the money is.
Well, I'm also a businessman. I have more business. But it, I might write 10 poems in a day, and it's coming.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a matter of energy. I don't think you know some is American home political for me the last 5 or 7 years. And just putting it together, seeing maybe while I'm putting it together is just deciding between the fiction.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish you every kind of good fortune and like work hard and outlast your doubt. That's my sort of general advice. People will sometimes say, and I'm sure you get this all the time, like you probably don't say I'm a novelist, but if somebody gets wind that you're a novelist, a civilian, non-writer, they will sometimes say, I imagine, because I get this. I thought about writing a novel.
Oh, yeah.
And I always want to say to them, great. I think you should do that. Let's meet in a year.
Right.
Because it's really easy to sort of have an idea, and it's like the whole thing is that you have to sit there in a room alone and make those decisions. And
I've had a lot of good ideas for paintings. Can I paint? Fuck no.
right.
But that doesn't mean, if that's what I wanted to do, that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. If I had ideas for paintings and that's what I wanted to do, I should learn to paint.
Right.
It's
And put in
just
like 10,000 hours.
exactly. Yeah.
But I think there's this idea, because all of us are naturally storytellers, that maybe I'll do that.
Right.
And the problem is, it just takes, if you're taking it seriously, it just takes a long time. And you're making a lot of decisions. And for a while in your apprentice stage, Secrets, I'm glad that it emerged in the way that it did, and it's a writer of your stature, and you found value in it and so forth. But there's like 4.5 failed novels and probably 10,000 hours of decisions that weren't ready to be in the world, that stand behind what, I think of it this way. There's on the internet, perhaps you've heard of it, there is a video that I'll sometimes watch when I'm feeling, just wasting time. And it's a video of a cat trying to jump onto a roof. And somebody is helpfully on the internet, as I mentioned, has kind of put the math over the cat's head, like, trajectory and force and so forth.
Yes.
And you're like, the cat's poised to jump. And you're like, do it, cat, you figured out the math, do it. And the cat leaps, and the cat misses by like a mile. It's out of the screen. And I always like that, because it's like, oh, that's my first 4 novels. And the reason that the cat finally reaches the roof, it turns out, and this is really like very, in its own way, kind of moving to me. The reason that the cat finally gets to the roof isn't because the cat gets better at math. Because that didn't happen. It's not because the cat goes to the cat gym and does like cat workouts and it's like suddenly supercharged. It's because the cat it fails so many times, and each time they fail, they learn a little bit something about what not to do. And by the time they failed enough, they leap from a little mountain of their own failure, and that's how they reach the roof. So that's how it feels to me, at least with this book. It's like, oh, I just had to fail a whole bunch, and then I finally got to it.
Yeah, the amount of patience I think that it really requires is what surprises a lot of people. What amount of time.
Right. I'll be waiting. Write that novel.
Yeah.
So there are lots of changes in publishing as everyone knows, especially YouTube, with traditional publishing not being the best thing sometimes. And a lot of authors, Sarah Grant was my started a promotion company and you're one of the leading books from Canada. Can you talk a little about Zendo and what they're doing? I'm fascinated with Molly Stern as a genius.
Yeah.
And I read Odyssey.
Yeah.
I just thought it's a weird book. It's very.
Totally weird.
Yeah, and I read her book, and I like what this stuff you're doing, I want to understand the mission.
Right, so the question is about Zando, which is this crazy company that Molly Stern started. So Molly Stern was, I think, the editor-in-chief of Penguin Random House. She was a big deal. She edited Michelle Obama's memoir, maybe you've heard of her, she's on the internet. And then also Gillian Flynn, a bunch of other people. She's a really big deal in publishing.
And Gillian has her own imprint.
Correct.
Right.
Right, and so part of what Molly realized the problem was with publishing, you as a bookseller would have a lot of insight, is that publishers put out, like 50, 70 books a year, and they kind of throw them against the wall and hope that a couple stick. And Molly got very frustrated because she knew that it was what she calls the problem of discoverability. That, like, how do you make sure that a book is going to get a fair shake? And so she went away from publishing for a couple of years, upset by the status quo. And when she decided to come back and start a book publishing company, which is, it's a little bit like, I don't know, it's a little bit like saying, oh, I want to start a chimney sweep company. It's like, it's a little bit outdated. That's not where the money is. Book company, really? But I think her plan was, well, we want to publish books that are very distinct and odd, but we also want to have a way of making sure they get discovered. And part of her plan for this was partnering with well-known actors and writers and people who are kind of famous for being readers, but also have their own distinct audiences, and forming these partnerships. So Sarah Jessica Parker, I think, is one, and Gillian Flynn is one, John Legend is another. And it's kind of interesting because she says essentially, we'll give you some books, you choose the ones you really like, and then you help us find readers for those books. Because I think what's frustrating, I was actually saying, earlier, Kristen, that what I love about Exile and Bookville is that you have all those recommendations. Because when I walk into a bookstore, I'm like, I don't know, there's like 10,000 books. And I got time to read about 1.5 of them before my 8-year-old, comes screaming like a banshee. So, help me out here, booksellers. And one way is that booksellers can write recommendations. Another is that somebody who you trust says, look, not only do I believe in this book, I'm going to do an event, or introduce this author, or I'm going to use my influence of my audience as a way of saying, I guarantee you will dig this book.
Right, I'll put my name on the line.
I'll put my name on the line, and I will use the audience that I have acquired, maybe even in other ways, to try to convert people into being readers of these particular books. I think it's pretty brilliant. I don't know if it will work, but I know that she is laser focused on the idea that it's virtually impossible for people to walk into a bookstore and kind of know what they should buy, the next book that's going to change their life.
Yeah. And I gotta say that Jack,
Yeah, matters.
I was really excited to see Nancy Reagan's eyes.
That was a question I had for you. It is Nancy Reagan.
Yeah.
It's Nancy Reagan.
Some people say it's Betty Davis eyes, but it's actually Nancy Reagan eyes.
And the scorpion. It's Nancy Reagan, a silhouette as a scorpion.
That's sort of Lorena in the desert, I think.
Yeah, that's how I saw it. Yeah, for sure. One question there. Yeah, you, green, please.
I have a two-part question. The first is, do you think about your reader as you write? And the second is, what do you hope happens to them?
What do I hope happens
To your readers?
to my readers? It's a great question. I don't think about my readers in a way, I think it's very dangerous when all right. A lot of why people make bad decisions as writers, and by people I mean me, is because I'm worried about whether the reader will be entertained and think that I'm smart and funny and insightful and noble, right? And when I'm in that set of concerns, it diverts my attention from the characters and their experiences, to whom the book belongs, naturally. My job is to be with Lorena and Tony and Graciela and the stalwarts. That's my job. And anything that distracts me from that is an ego drama that is not in the surface of the story. So I do not think when things are going well about the reader at all. But I do trust that if they have a book in their hands, they're pretty smart and they're able to free themselves. They're able to arrest their attention in the midst of distraction. The fact that they have my book is an indication that if I don't betray them by making a lazy, self-regarding decision, and I honestly use the language to convey a story that is emotionally dangerous and that leads them into their own moral confusions, that they will stay with me. So I don't think about the reader other than as like somebody that I want to be really generous towards because they're my collaborator. And I say that because we're living in a time where movies and TV are the predominant forms of storytelling. And what I see, and I'm sure you see, is a million stories and novels that begin with a scene, because that's how movies do it. And the thing about stories is that they have narrators who say once upon a time, and they bring the reader in. It's like being told the story at night. A good novel has that feeling like, oh, I trust that I'm never going to get confused. I'm never going to be in a state of unproductive bewilderment, meaning I don't know what's happening, I don't know who's speaking to me, I don't know what's at stake for them. The job of a really good story or novel or essay or memoir is to engage productively with our bewilderment, the things that we don't understand and that we lament, like why people we love die, or why we choose the wrong relationships, or ... How do we escape from the sorrow of our childhood? Like all these things that are genuinely bewildering to us. And a really great novel or whatever it is brings us into that state of productive bewilderment. It induces us to be productively bewildered. So I don't think about the reader other than to be really generous to them and try to make sure that they never fall out of what I call, or John Gardner called, the continuous dream of the story.
Yeah.
And when the reader doesn't know what's happening and they get confused and they don't know the things that the character knows, they fall out of that dream. So I really don't think about like, how do I charm them or entertain them? I just think, how do I keep them in the story?
I think there's a sense too, like for me, and I was like, like a theater kid, there's a sense of you're talking to the back row, you're singing to the back row, you're cleaning the back row. Do I know who's in the back row? No. Do I care who's in the back row? Not really. I just know that there's a back row.
Right.
Like I need to project that far. I need to give them enough that they understand what's happening.
Right.
Which for a novelist is like, am I being generous enough? Am I orienting?
Right.
Am I including you?
Right.
Without going, well, I wonder if my ex is going to read this.
Right, right. Or, oh my God, they're gonna get bored, I better do something.
Oh God, yeah, right.
Your second question, Josh, was about like, what do I hope will happen to the reader? And that's really basic. In a social novel, the job of the novelist is, I think, not to advertise the noble sentiments of the author. Like the super ego job that says, oh, we know Reagan was quite terrible and, we shouldn't treat immigrants like they're subhuman and all that stuff. It's much more when a social novel is working well to lead the reader into their own moral confusion. And I think that's what good books do, is they implicate the reader. They get the reader emotionally and morally involved in a way that's very distinct from other kinds of art.
I think we have time for one last question, and we had one I actually want to ask you.
Sure. So back in the late 80s, when I was a high school student in the North Shore of Chicago, my older brother was a freshman at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut.
I've heard of it.
I spent my spring break visiting him in a dorm called Cross Creek.
Wow.
And at the time, the student newspaper there, the Wesleyan Argus, featured a columnist an unusually sensitive and, to my mind, brilliant writer. That was, of course, Jonathan Safran Foer.
Oh, okay. He was quite young.
This writer, who I believe, and I still assume was an undergrad at the time, had a column called the Weltschmerz Symphony. To use a term that I'm guessing was not familiar, perhaps to 100% of the attending flight students of university. And I was in minor awe of the skill of writing at the time. I think
You'll be happy to know it's regressed.
And actually, sadly, my brother became sick and did not go back to Western after his freshman year. But from spring break to the end of the school year, I had him flip out and saved for you your remaining columns from that school. Would you mind talking a little about your experience either as an undergrad columnist in college or even perhaps back in Palo Alto, we did such a thing in high school? The one other thing I want to say is that as somebody who always loved to write and who has since done some writing, one of the things I read 2 puzzles a week currently for the New York Times.
Whoa.
But I was.
I want to know more about that.
Well, yeah,
Go ahead.
We all just clicked off of everything.
Sorry, thank you. My point was simply, as somebody who has always struggled with, in trying to write, someone struggled with revealing myself and felt inhibited. I was stunned by the degree to which you were willing to open a vein and share your innermost thoughts, and you wrote so beautifully and so sensitively that 30, whatever, plus 40 going on years later, I deeply remember.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh my
What a-
God.
I paid somebody a lot of money for that.
Please take that as a compliment.
I do.
Incredible.
I need to take a shower. Yeah, I mean, it's such a sweet thing to say. I think of that column like, with a little bit of embarrassment, as you do about your behavior in college.
Sure.
But then you realize, like, obviously you like that and it did something for you. So I'm very glad that you decided to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I write about, I have this little craft book that I wrote and self-published because I didn't see anything in the world that was like it. It's called This Won't Take But a Minute, Honey. And now I'm actually going to, with Zando, publish the next book I'm going to publish is a craft book, like a big expanded
I'm
craft
excited.
book.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
called Truth is the Arrow and Mercy is the Bow. And the idea of, the reason I mentioned the title is because that's something to do with the reason that and it probably has something to do with having parents who are psychoanalysts, which is now your turn to freak out, is that we're all kind of trying to keep a secret what's happening inside of us. This very volatile, painful, vulnerable, confusing inner life that we have. And it's a job of novelists in a way to help us make it a little safer to experience the inner life by entering together into the lives of fictional characters. But for me, I think probably because of what my parents did for a living, which is to kind of let people express their inner life, somehow through osmosis, it became clear to me that that was okay, and probably also a great relief if we would be more honest about how confused we are, how frightened we are, how angry we are, how kind of mixed up or sometimes disappointed. And it's like Nick Hornby has this great line in his book about soccer. He says, it's all in there looking for a way out. It's all in there looking for a way out. And that's kind of how I feel instinctually. And I think that column was like an early symptom of that feeling, that it was my job to investigate, or what I wanted to do on Earth in my brief little span was to investigate the inner life. And I was a journalist for a while, and that was great, and I loved it. And I still think that's an amazing thing to do because it forced me out into the world of scorpions and heavy metal bands and everything else that I was able to do as a journalist. And it made me curious about how people operate, why they make the disastrous decisions they do. But I ultimately went back to that pursuit of the inner life because that's kind of the job of literature, is to try to understand and make, not safe exactly, but make the danger possible for the reader of, kind of what, everything that people are carrying around, all the sorrow and confusion and stuff. But thank you, I'm very glad you've heard of the Belchford Symphony, a super pretentious name for that column.
I was a columnist for my college paper as well, and the thing that among many of the word limitation was really educational for me, of like, you gotta cut out the words, how are you gonna do it? But also, I'd write a thing, and then the paper would go out, and they kind of walk across campus, seeing people pick up the paper.
Yeah.
And read, and I could tell sometimes on the back page, so I knew if it, and I just, and it was like an immediate,
Right.
like gratification for result, feedback kind of thing,
Yeah.
that like.
It was hard
Yeah.
it was hard to leave journalism where I was used to, like, everybody in your work gets printed, to go into the world of, writing stories and novels, especially.
Yeah.
And maybe eventually will come
Right,
out.
right, several
it's gonna
years
take a
from
long
now,
time.
you'll never see anyone read it, and yeah. So this is a huge accomplishment, I'm so excited. A promising debut.
Professional voice, just a toddler.
But I'm so excited for all of you who have yet to read it, because you're gonna fucking love it. And I know both of us are excited to chat more, just maybe more back there over drinks. So do that, buy books,
Yes, buy books.
listen to whatever Javier's about to say.
Yes,
It's really important.
Yes, not as, yes, but, thank you all for coming. By the way, we're here, everyone that tuned in via Zoom. For those guys out there in the Zoom world, you can purchase both these books and many others by both these authors, wonderful authors. If you go to exileMVP.com, you will ship all over the country. Include our incredible bookmark, and they will be signed.
I was trying to, Kristen was doing amazing.
Exactly.
I studied Chester.
So yeah,
Nice.
and for everyone here, books for sale back there. There's some wine to be had. These two will personalize. They will.
I'll personalize him and
Exactly,
personalize
yeah.
mine, or vice versa.
We're doing something different here today. Thank you all for coming. Buy lots of books, and have a good night.
Yeah.